Right. Hmm. So how's the weather in Santa Fe?
It's a bit windy, but it could be worse. It
Are
could be
you guys
worse.
supposed to get a dump of snow tonight too?
I don't think so. I think if we get anything, it's going to be a dusting. But we
Mm.
might. We might. I don't know. I kind of hope we don't. With the legislature in session, they're going to require us all to be up here at 8 o'clock no matter what. So, um,
Oh, right. My goodness. That's a lot. It sounds like you have a pretty exciting job.
no, I actually don't in many ways. I don't actually even do archaeology anymore. I just literally pay bills and make sure contracts are processed and oversee other people that do really
Do
interesting
archaeology.
things. Yeah.
I can sympathize with that. Yes. Being an administrator has its drawbacks, for
Yeah.
sure.
So
So
I wouldn't say I love at all my aspects of my job, but I get that it's an important job to have, and it's a great. I mean, be honest, it's an excellent way to wrap up my career. So I should not. I'm not complaining at all. So
no, it is. I mean, somebody has to manage all those archaeologists, right? So that's
yeah.
what I do. Oh, fantastic. If you are just joining us, we've got about 1 minute to go and we will get started. So, welcome. Hmm. I have to say, you're the only person I've ever moderated wearing a turkey aloha shirt. That is so awesome.
I wore one to the Senate Finance Committee meeting on Tuesday too. So
Hero, that is so awesome. We
yeah.
love turkeys around here. Many reasons, ancient
Yep.
and the ones walking down the road and the ones in the archaeological sites and everything else. So, hmm. One of our longtime board members and researchers, Bill Leip, has been
Yep.
a fanatic about turkey pens in the final years of his research career. So we are all very familiar with turkey pens now. All right. Okay. We have just turned 4 o'clock. Welcome everyone to Crook Canyon's first webinar of 2025. I'm so excited to be back with everybody. I've missed these so much in the off season. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to go through some of our usual updates. If you are joining our webinar series for the first time, Crow Canyon is a nonprofit research and education center here in Southwest Colorado near Mesa Verde National Park, where we're hopefully getting some snow tonight. If you are new to us or at all new to Zoom, if you have questions at any point during the presentation today, you can put them in the Q&A and we will get to them at the end if at all possible. When people start chatting in the chat, then we can miss the questions sometimes. If Zoom is giving you difficulties, I believe Taylor does have us up and live streaming on Facebook. And if you aren't already, please do check out our YouTube channel because you can see our past webinars there. I'd like to begin with some acknowledgements that our campus here is on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Jicarilla Apache people. And we'd like to acknowledge that with the work that we're doing here at Crow Canyon, we are seeking to bring light into the darkness of memory that these lands, waters, wildlife, and her descendants hold because of policies of removal, genocide, and displacement. And at Crow Canyon, we seek paths that support and align with Indigenous people and communities. With gratitude, we honor the contributions of present-day Indigenous communities, descendants, and the colleagues with whom we partner, who have helped guide to our work and our mission and still do today. So we have some exciting programs this year, and I believe that we've had some cancellations and some openings. So if you're considering a program this spring and early summer with Crow Canyon, please do check it out. Check out our website or email any of us. We have Living Memory, Cultural Convergences in Northern New Mexico happening in April, which should be amazing. We have a brand new program around birding in the Pueblo world in May, and we still have some openings on the Green River, which is also a camping trip. It should be absolutely amazing. So please consider signing up for some of our cultural explorations programs this year. Coming up next week and the week after. For our webinars next year, we have Staying Warm in Ice Age, Wyoming, Evidence for Clothing Protection with Dr. Spencer Pelton. And we have the week after that, Indigenous Archaeology Through Consent, Consensus, and Collaboration with Dr. Aguilar. So please keep showing up every Thursday now that we're back up and running. As always, this is an entirely free webinar series made possible by you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We could not do our work without you. Our work is almost entirely supported by philanthropy, and we are so grateful for those of you who donate. And if you would like to donate easily, there is a QR code that you can point your phone at below. And our intrepid fundraising team has also just landed on a new way to give to support projects and programs in the mission at Crow Canyon. If you have a car that you would like to get rid of, just call this number. You can check out our website and someone will come and get it and turn it into funding for good work at Crow Canyon. So let us know if you have any questions. This is a new program we just set up this year and we're very excited about it. And I have a crappy car that might be going into this program very soon. Without further ado, we are so excited to introduce our first speaker of the year. Matthew Barbour has degrees in anthropology from the University of New Mexico and has worked for the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs since 2002. He is currently the Deputy Director and the Acting Executive Director of New Mexico Historic Sites. Throughout his 23-year career, he has published over 200 nonfiction articles and monographs. In 2012 and again in 2014, Mr. Barbour was awarded the City of Santa Fe Heritage Preservation Award for Excellence in Archaeology. In 2018, under his management, Coronado Historic Site received an Award of Merit from the American Association for State and Local History. And then in 2019, Jemez Historic Site received the Archaeology Heritage Preservation from New Mexico, from the New Mexico Historic Preservation Division. We are so happy to meet you and to learn from you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I should probably share my screen now. So let me. All right, hopefully my screen is showing right now with an image of Kuaua Pueblo or digital reconstruction, is it?
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay, good. So I'm going to be talking about, yes, thank you very much, Liz. Thank you for having me here. It's great to support Crow Canyon. And I would also pledge that you guys really please do support Crow Canyon. They're doing some amazing stuff. They've been doing research up in southwestern Colorado for a long, long time. It's an amazing place to visit. And the work is top notch. So today I won't be talking about Crow Canyon per se. I'll be talking about Kuaua Pueblo, which is a ancestral Native American pueblo or village located in central New Mexico, just north of Albuquerque. And the focus of this talk, which I have given before in other outlets, I actually redid the PowerPoint. So anybody who actually has seen this before, there's actually a lot of additional slides and probably my ramblings that go into this presentation from before, but specifically focusing in on Pueblo identity and using Coronado Historic Site or the Pueblo of Kuaua as a case example for discussing some of the challenges in talking about Pueblo culture and trying to fit everything in a nice, neat box. So that's going to move on to the second slide. And to the next. I actually take the impression, so I like to have pictures, but I also like to have notes on the slides. And the reason for that is specifically if I say something that seems slightly out of line, you can follow along with my notes or go, what did he actually mean by that? You know, I believe in writing what you say. So there will be some text in these slides. Also, there will be my contact information at the bottom. So while I back of the end of the slides, so even while I'm going to answer questions at the end of this presentation, there will also be the opportunity if you're like, can I really get the article where they say blah, blah, blah? I'll be absolutely, and I can send you the references for that article or anything I specifically say in this presentation. But when we use the term Pueblo, to start with, Pueblo culture is a problematic term. We all use it. I want to be very clear. Archaeologists all throughout the Southwest use the term like it's going out of style, including myself, but it is problematic. When we use the term Pueblo today to view modern day indigenous populations, we're usually involving a suite of cultural traits, which include cuisine, building methods, art, religion, and a lot of these are largely the result not of Native American peoples in the American Southwest per se, but really their interactions with European and Mesoamerican peoples. A lot of the things you would see in New Mexico, in northern New Mexico, when you come here today, as Pueblo culture actually comes from other locations. And of course, Pueblo is a Spanish word that means village, and it was used to distinguish early on amongst the Spanish to distinguish those Native Americans living in villages with a sort of similar cultural suite of traits, really to distinguish them from more mobile hunter and gatherer groups. So those are your Apaches or Utes or other mobile groups that were also in the American Southwest and have, as to be clear, have as much antiquity as the Pueblo peoples, just had a different lifestyle or a different way of operating in many cases. So when we say Pueblo today, it's usually used to stereotype and homogenize a group of very, very distinct cultures archaeologically. And every Pueblo has its own unique story as far as that cultural composition goes, as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I'm going to try to show you with this lecture. So the goals of this lecture are such. We're going to begin with an overview of Native American cultures in the American Southwest, because I do recognize that the group of people that are on this meeting today are probably a pretty diverse group, may or may not have a lot of experience in what Southwestern cultures are really all about, or Native American cultures. And we're going to dig a little deeper into Kuaua Pueblo, or Coronado Historic Site, which is one of the historic sites I oversee and manage at the current time, before having the position of deputy director and unfortunately acting director for a little while longer. I was actually the manager overseeing Coronado and Jemez historic sites. And while my archaeological background is largely in the city of Santa Fe and in the Jemez area, I have done a little bit of work at Coronado, and certainly I've overseen a lot of work at Coronado in recent years with the discovery of the attacks by Coronado at the site and so on. And then we're going to focus, after we dig a little bit into Coronado, we're going to specifically look at the term Kuaua as the traditional term used by by several different Native American groups located in and around Kuaua today, and what those meanings, what the word Kuaua means to those different groups, and what it may have meant for those people residing in the village during the prehistoric era. Broad overview of the American Southwest. I like to just start with this. I think it's fascinating in general. Humans entered the Americas via the Bering Strait about 16,000 years ago. Whether they were coastal or whether they followed an ice-free corridor, I think most people would go with the coastal hypothesis now. I know there is another hypothesis that the early Native Americans came from, or the early colonists of North America came from Europe. That's really, that to me is relatively hokey and not something I would pursue academically. But the most interesting theory about the coastal migration is that perhaps they got to the swamps in what is now the Sonoran Desert. We're hunting some megafauna, specifically like a swamp elephant, whose name I will butcher here by saying Gomp there. And they hunted this animal possibly to extinction, moved into the American Southwest through the San Pedro Valley in Arizona, and then kind of pushed out from there, forming what we would call Clovis culture. Of course, those groups hunt those animals to extinction. That is not a slander against Native American culture. Any place where there's studies been made where human beings enter into a new environment, such as Australia, usually mass extinction events quickly follow human arrival on different locations. And that's what exactly happens in North America. And as the megafauna are depleted, during the Paleo-Indian period, people start to focus more and more on local resources. And eventually they begin to diversify into more and more focus on plant resources. One of the kind of more fascinating things I think with plant resources, that if you're just to say really quickly, is why do they focus so much on meat early on? Well, we don't know for certain. And some people would say they did focus on plants right away. That seems very unlikely. If you were in a survival scenario today and people were to teach you what you can and can't eat, if they were to, you're stuck out in the woods and you don't know what to eat. The good news is you can almost kill any animal, cook it, and eat it, and you will be perfectly safe. With plants, that is not true. Most plants, if you eat them, you will get very, very sick. It takes time on the in the environment, learning what you can and can't eat, how to process it, and so on, to kind of get to that point. And really, if we were to look at that in the kind of human history of the American Southwest, by a period we call the Archaic period, about 7,000 years ago, people started to kind of more and more know what they could and could not manipulate on the landscape as far as plant products go. And eventually, agriculture, which is developed in Mesoamerica, also appears to come into the Southwest, probably via that same corridor of the San Pedro Valley in Arizona. And in the Four Corners area, this archaic tradition of a focus more on plant resources, a kind of more regional adaptation on the landscape is sometimes known as the Oshara tradition. And these folks were probably living in distinct groups by this point in time. As agriculture gets going, people become more and more settled, right? And as people get more and more settled, their different cultural traits, their languages and stuff like that start to diverge. And languages begin to diverge. Most over the majority of the American Southwest, over much of it, I shouldn't say that, not even the majority. Many of the locals spoke a language in a language family that we call Kiowa-Tanoan language group nowadays. And eventually, over time, as these groups started to intermingle less and less, their words diverged, and they kind of grew into their own little language groups. And in the area of the Middle Rio Grande, Kuaua, which we'll get to a map in a minute, the people in that area spoke a language which we call Tiwa. And it was different from Tewa and Tano and Toa. These were all different languages being spoken. But they certainly weren't the only peoples, right? As I said with the Apaches and Utes, that even when this group of settled villagers was going in the American Southwest, there was a lot of other peoples living in the Southwest too, who didn't focus specifically on agriculture and perhaps stuck to those more traditional, archaic hunter and gatherer roles of exploiting plants and animal resources regionally or migrating around the area. It's also important to note that the Kiowa-Tanoan languages were not the only languages spoken by these people living in villages. Some peoples spoke a different group of languages, which we tend to group as Mogollon, which we don't know much about that language today, but we can say that the Zuni language is probably the last remaining family in that line or language in that line per se. So all of these different groups are moving and shaking on the landscape. The reason I'm pointing out the Mogollon is they will come into play with our narrative as far as Kuaua Pueblo in a little bit. Pueblo as a term, as a cultural term, is actually more in line not with a specific culture or a specific language, but rather a bigger group of people, Germanic or Latin. It's utilized similar to that, but even in the case of Latin and Germanic or German, they at least shared a root language or identity or fictional, not even fictional, mythological past. That may not be the case necessarily with all the groups labeled as Pueblo. And in fact, it can be easily argued that many of these groups had unique social structures and belief systems even before the mass migrations, which of Pueblo peoples, which will happen in the American Southwest and the arrival of European influence. In fact, most of the similarities when we use the term Pueblo are largely superficial. Did they make pottery? Yes. Pueblo people were not the only Native American groups to make pottery. Did they construct their houses, at least during later time periods, of stone or adobe masonry? Yes, but the type of masonry they used was pretty unique to the different region. Almost all of the similarities that we tend to use in that group where we use the word Pueblo are really superficial and really actually encompasses a lot of really different kind of ways of living. And perhaps the best example I can give here is I'm showing a picture of Chaco Canyon. At about 900 or 1000 AD, Chaco has amazing stone architecture with really elaborate ritual structures, which we would call kivas. At the same time period, if you were to teleport to Kuaua Pueblo or the middle Rio Grande around Albuquerque, what you would find is people living in relatively small pit houses dispersed along the terrace above the Rio Grande. Both groups would be classified as Puebloan, but their adaptations were very, I mean, you would have a hard time going back in time and walking amongst both groups and saying they were the same peoples by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, they didn't even speak probably language groups that were similar, with likely the people at Kuaua or in the area of Kuaua during this time speaking Tiwa language, whereas the people at Chaco may have spoken Keres, which is a separate language group. This was somewhat changed with several large migrations. The first one extending out of Chaco Canyon into the Mesa Verde and the Crow Canyon region, as displayed in the topmost picture on the slide, and then later a mass migration out of southwestern Colorado into areas specifically in the middle and northern Rio Grande. These periods, in general, Pueblo society has gone through many periods of growth, followed by drought, which has destroyed backing up a second here. The American Southwest is marginal for agriculture in general. In fact, in most places, I think you'd be amazed to walk around and imagine that people were able to feed, these Native American groups were able to feed the numbers of people they were with dry farming and irrigation agriculture. Stone Age, literally Stone Age, and they were able to feed large populations. In fact, there are places in the Jemez Mountains that they grew corn that we would be hard pressed to grow corn in today. Now, that has to do with the different varieties of corn and the way they approached the methods of growing corn, but we would be hard pressed to feed 100 people off that food, let alone some of the population estimates in the Jemez Mountains for during the classic period in the Middle Rio Grande. But these droughts led to often societal collapse, and other people have different reasons why these collapses occurred. Maybe it was likely a multitude of reasons why it happened, but then people migrate into different areas. The process starts over again. You see development in large scale villages being brought up. The key to remember about this is that the Rio Grande was an attractive prospect for people migrating out of southwestern Colorado. It's a relatively large river for the American Southwest. It is one of the largest. And this brought a lot of folks that had not lived in the middle Rio Grande into contact with those people that were living there. And what we can really see is how these people all migrated in. This is not the great slide. I have actually a better language slide later on. But what I want to point out with this slide, because this was one of my added slides to look at language groups in the 17th century. So when the Spanish arrive, there are multiple linguistic groups living right next door to one another. The different groups you see here represent Tanos, Tiwas, Towas. The Towas are actually in two areas. There's a group of them living in the Jemez Mountains and perhaps a group living along the Pecos River. There are the Tewas up north. There's the northern Tiwas up by Taos and Picaries, as well as the southern Tiwas, which includes Sandia Pueblo, what will become Sandia Pueblo, or the areas around Albuquerque, and Isleta, as well as Kuaua Pueblo, which is the one that's our focus today. It's also interesting to note the Piros and Tompiros, while they're separated, there's problematic. The only thing separating those two groups is Abo Pass in central New Mexico, maybe even little at the very bottom end of the middle Rio Grande in New Mexico, and Abo Pass was probably a great thoroughfare for groups traveling between those two locations. The kind of solidifying of all of these groups. So in the 17th century, there's all these linguistic clusters with all these people living side by side with each other, but still living distinct cultural ways and having their own heritages, their own languages, and so on. Really, the kind of ethnogenesis or the bringing together of a Pueblo identity really comes when you introduce the other. And for this case, the other was the Spanish. The Spanish enter into New Mexico in 1540s, first with the Coronado expedition, but then settle under, there's a failed colony, a failed slave colony by Sosa. That doesn't work out. But eventually, Oñate comes in and they establish the first real permanent colony in New Mexico. They establish it just north of Española, and this will become the province of New Mexico. The Spanish come in with the term Pueblo, begin the process of, unfortunately, subjugation and Hispanicization, which is making them potentially good subjects under the Spanish crown, which also means introducing Catholicism in a variety of different traits, which we see kind of come into Pueblo culture during this time. Of course, the short-term results of this colonization is, of course, resistance. We have many Native uprisings in New Mexico. Just citing the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 and the Pueblo Revolt of 1694 is insufficient to really garner how many revolts there were. The amazing thing about the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 is how unified the Native American peoples had become. In one case, you could say that perhaps the Hispanicization or the turning them into Pueblo peoples unified them in a way that allowed them to work collaboratively together, at least in the short run, to kick the Spanish out. But I digress. So what are some of the kind of aspects of Pueblo identity that actually come from these other groups? Well, one of the ones that you probably think of as a very traditional role in Pueblo society is the term cacique. Cacique is actually an Arawak word, and it actually comes from early Spanish interactions with the Taino peoples in the Caribbean. And the idea that there is a chief, they need to find that chief, that he is some sort of hereditary ruler over peoples. Whether Pueblo society, any Pueblo villages had hereditary rulers or at least rulers for life prior to the coming of the Spanish is highly problematic. Of course, that term takes off in Pueblo society. Watermelon's another one, right? That's not local to the American Southwest. Chili. Chili may have been in the Southwest in very small amounts prior to the coming of the Spanish, but really the use of chili to season everything is definitely a trait that comes in with the Mesoamerican natives that come with the Spanish, as well as Spanish culture by the time the colonization occurred. Domestic animals is probably one that you know about and you can easily get to. Ovens are another thing because ovens come in with the Spanish. While there were baking ovens in the ground, the horno itself is really made for baking bread. Although at historic sites, we're very proud. It also works really great as a wood-fired pizza oven too. Just keep that in mind for me. Really brought in for flour in the production of oven, so things that you think of today as Pueblo, very quintessential, Pueblo meals such as oven bread really are not something that would have been done by Native American peoples prior to the coming of the Spanish. They just couldn't. Acequia agriculture. There's some debate on that. True acequia culture comes from North Africa and Spain. It's an Arabic tradition of maintaining your fields. It works really well. There is definitely some argument that can be made in some areas that ditch-based agriculture of fields did occur prior to the coming of the Spanish, but the elaborate acequia system really is developed by the Spanish, even though all Pueblo peoples along the Rio Grande, all Pueblos use that today. Similarly, polished black and redware pottery, there's some debate over this because certainly polished black and redware pottery existed in the American Southwest prior to the coming of the Spanish. Certainly they had the the knowledge, the elaborate pottery technology and knowledge of it to make those kind of things. However, if we look, the honest truth is that if you look at the Tewa Pueblos in the 17th century, they switch from in essence, black and white or black on cream pottery to a red polychrome pottery with the coming of the Spanish. In fact, what I'm showing you here in the the lower picture here is a Spanish soup plate. So the form is actually Spanish too. This is a Tewa polychrome vessel made by Native American peoples, depicting Spanish lace patterns on a soup plate. So while the form and the person who made this is very much Native American, the depictions located on the plate were very much in turn signifying their cultural assimilation in Spanish culture. And interestingly enough, we have archaeologists to thank for this stuff not being part of our museum collections nowadays, because in the early 20th century, archaeologists, late 19th, early 20th century, archaeologists were really concerned with trying to bring Native American people back to their traditional pottery styles, and really tossed out a lot of the stuff and would not pay for it to try to curb the market back towards more traditional forms and more traditional decorative styles. Obviously Pueblo Village Association, most Pueblos have a name associated with a saint today. That is obviously associated with Spanish coming and not the traditional naming of these villages. The feast days are located around saints and so on and so forth. But also things that existed in some Pueblo cultures were homogenized to all Pueblo cultures, so the majority of Pueblo cultures. A good example of this is the duality and moiety system that you see in many traditional Pueblo societies. So I want to tell you, if you go to feast day at Zia Pueblo, you'll see two moieties dancing, a pumpkin or summer moiety and a winter or turquoise moiety dancing at the village. That is authentic to Zia Pueblo. You go see the same dance at Jemez Pueblo, you will see, once again, a summer and winter moiety dance. That is not authentic to the Jemez people. That was something the priests added in the 18th century as a way of organizing the Jemez people into understanding in terms of how Pueblo people should actually behave. And they very likely took two perhaps sub-ethnic groups in the Jemez Mountains and kind of made them there was getting sidetracked on that one. I'm not going to explain that one right now because I'm going to try to keep going on the slides. So with all that said, we get this homogenization with Spanish. How does Kuaua Pueblo kind of fit in this? Kuaua Pueblo is located at Coronado Historic Site in Bernalillo, New Mexico. At its height, the village probably had about 1,000 ground floor rooms, and it's just south of the confluence of the Rio Jemez and in Rio Grande, making it suitable to serve as a center of trade. Interestingly, that area of people at Kuaua Pueblo farmed the floodplain that you see in the picture above, as well as produced glazeware pottery. In fact, initial Spanish accounts of the area was to call it Weaver's Bend. Cotton was really important to Kuaua Pueblo. Cotton was important to indigenous groups since at least the Archaic period. It comes in very early on, and certainly it was used primarily as a clothing source for many Pueblo peoples. People tend to think of Native Americans as living and walking around in hides and stuff like that. That isn't the case. Cotton was used to produce things like kilts, mantas, sashes, and other items. Archaeological evidence of looms are common in many kivas throughout the American Southwest, including Kuaua Pueblo. Specifically, the notion that this area was known as Weaver's Bend in New Mexico history still lives on today. In fact, the town just north of Bernalillo, New Mexico, is called Algodones, or the Cottons. And no, it's not in reference to the cottonwoods. So there's a completely different word for that. But it's just the area just north of Kuaua Pueblo today is known as Algodones. Here's an overview of what Kuaua Pueblo looks like as far as the excavated rooms go. Archaeological evidence for the region suggests people were living there as early as about 800 AD. This area is sometimes, this time period is quite known locally in the northern and middle Rio Grande as the developmental period. This is that time period where I said they were living in pit houses and so forth. It's also by this time there was definitely a difference between the language being spoken in the Four Corners, or possibly I would guess in the Four Corners. I'm not an expert on the area, but probably something close to what Tewa is today. These people were speaking a different language, which, while similar linguistically, was known as Tewa. And by about 1200 AD, they start to move to they get into some really elaborate pit houses later on. But even by the time you have monumental art, in essence, almost monumental architecture in the Four Corners area, they're just moving to above ground room blocks in the middle Rio Grande. And certainly we have people kind of coalescing at Kuaua Pueblo during this time. Hold on before I go on to my next slide. By the Classic period, by about 1300 AD, they are starting to build this village you see before you. And they build it in blocks, eventually leading up to what it would be at its height at about 1540. So this village would reach its peak in 1540. We're almost confident that it was 1540 in which this village reached its peak, for a very sad reason. That it was not before, it did not go on. I mean, it was not as large after 1540, unfortunately. But it started in the south with the South Plaza. And as you can see here in this image, before I go on to the next one, you'll notice that the southernmost portion of the village, which is the oldest, there are several round circles inside that plaza. Those represent the initial kivas built at Kuaua Pueblo. As you move north, both in the South Plaza and then in the North Plaza, you will see several larger square structures being built. And then into the East Plaza as well. Those are square kivas that were added. And literally from the South Plaza, the North Plaza was added, and then the East Plaza was the last thing added before 1540. It's not to say the village doesn't go past 1540, but the height of the village is 1540. That whole thing's not surviving past 1540. All right. So it was a relatively small village when it started on the South Plaza with those. Then all of a sudden in 1400, the village undergoes rapid expansion. And I talked about those migrations out of the Four Corners. And maybe those are driving some of the population increase. Many pueblos grew during the Classic period to kind of introduce some of those migrants. However, there's a couple reasons to think that those migrants did not come from the Four Corners in the case of Kuaua, interestingly. During expansion at Kuaua, square kivas were added to the village, and design elements in those kivas really focused on elements that you would typically see depicted in iconography found in southern New Mexico and in southern Arizona, in an area known as the Mogollon. In fact, the imagery at the murals at Kuaua, which were excavated from one of the kivas, really kind of, and be clear, I apologize here. I'm not going to show all the images at Kuaua Pueblo for a variety of reasons, mostly out of cultural sensitivity and respect for the Native American peoples that live in the area today. Those are ceremonial images. However, they do give us permission to show several mural images, one of which is this black-tailed jackrabbit. So I just want to give you an idea as to what some of these murals look like. But many of these attributes were reminiscent of Mogollon peoples. In fact, we've known this for a long time. There was a book actually written on the murals of Kuaua Pueblo. And while I'm not going to get into the depictions of the murals and why they probably are, or why there can be an argument made that they're depictions of more Mogollon-esque spiritual beings, when they actually did the excavations of the murals and then finally sat down to write about the murals in general, in Bertha Dutton's book from 1963, they were actually interpreted through a Zuni interpreter, Zuni being likely the only last lens of kind of that Mogollon tradition. If they wanted to do something more in line with Northern Pueblo culture, a better use of an informant would have probably been somebody from Hopi. And in fact, this may speak to the Zuni connections overall. I'm not going to, if you are really interested in this book, it does still exist and it's an academic work. You can go to it. Many of the other academic works on murals, like I would point out, unfortunately, Pottery Mound, done by Fib and Hibben, really probably not. I think some of the good scholarship that's done today points to some of the problems with taking any of the interpretation from Pottery Mound seriously. For example, an article by Helen Crotty more recently pointed out that the so-called jaguar motif reported on in the book on Pottery Mound, that if you actually look back at the field notes, he didn't actually have spots. So that's kind of wrong to actually say that when you can go back to the field notes and realize he didn't have any spots. I don't know why you're calling him a jaguar. But in this case, we still have these murals. You can actually, these murals still exist in several museums today. In fact, some of the murals are on display, including the one depicted on the front cover here at Kuaua Pueblo. And you can see those. It's also important to note, though, that when you go into the reconstructed Kiva today, that it's just a small sampling of the murals as they were going. They were actually reinterpreted by a Zia artist named Ma Pei Wei in the early 20th century. He actually redrew them. He actually took images from all 17 layers, painted layers, and kind of combined them on there. So there's a couple problems with that. If you really want to get into nitpicky, they were put in different places than where they existed. But it's very interesting, without going into details about the murals. One of the things that always surprises me about the murals were probably painted over the course of about 200 years, which means that nobody in living history would have necessarily seen the painted layers that came before. And yet certain images disappear from the painted layers and then show up later on. In fact, the Koshari, which you can see a Coronado, the most recent version of which you can see in the murals depicted at Kuaua Pueblo today, that Koshari actually appears off and on throughout the Kiva's history, and he's replaced with several other images during different time periods of the past, where another being or animal substituted in his place, but he always reappears. I just find that interesting, that kind of continuity that you can see in religious artwork of the Pueblo peoples, which is to say that there is a lot of continuity and the story doesn't change very much over time. Whatever the story is, and I'm not interpreting that story, whatever that story is, it doesn't change. Let's keep going though. I'm going to come out of time really quickly. Interestingly enough, there's other evidence to suggest that these folks coming into Kuaua Pueblo were Mogollon. The most interesting study was a study done in 2017 by a grad student out of UNM. They were actually interested in biological diversity and figuring out where the Guyana people went to and where, so not studies of genetics necessarily, but studies of bone structure and stuff like that. I know probably part of your mind's like, isn't that what the Nazis did and stuff like that? Doesn't that really not work? It does work a little bit. But interestingly enough, when they clustered all the Pueblo peoples, because unfortunately, because Kuaua Pueblo had been fully excavated, or not fully excavated, but mostly excavated, they had a large population to draw from in the study, and they compared other groups as well. Kuaua Pueblo's closest biological group that it clustered nowhere near Guyana. It never even, to be clear, Kuaua Pueblo didn't even cluster anywhere with the Middle Rio Grande Pueblos at all. Its closest cluster was actually this Pueblo here, which is in the study, which is Canishpa Pueblo in the Mogollon Highlands. And it clustered better with Casas Grandes or Paquime than it did with the other Middle Rio Grande Pueblos. The people probably at Kuaua Pueblo looked a lot different from their neighbors. And once again, is this the only, is this a silver bullet that explains it all, or, really puts the pin on it? No, not really. But you use these multiple cases of evidence. The iconography is more Mogollon. The biological diversity, the people, their bone structure looked more like Mogollon people than it did like other northern Pueblo peoples. All of these things are just pointing to the fact that there is a different group at Kuaua Pueblo during this time. And it might explain what's going on here. I thought it was interesting it was Canishpa that was closest, not Zuni, not Pakime, but it was Kanishpa, which interestingly enough, Kanishpa is abandoned right at the time Kuawa was taking on a whole bunch of people. It's not to say they're from Kanishpa. It's probably some of the group is from that general Mogollon Highland area. Anyway, Kuawa's going great. And then this dude arrives from central Mexico. His name is Francisco Coronado, or Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, official name. He fought a battle at Kuaua Pueblo. He probably fought battles at almost every pueblo in the middle Rio Grande. That's probably the sad truth of it is. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. The extent and the consequences of the military action are still being explored, but the action itself seems to correlate with a large scale either abandonment or lowering of population at Kuaua Pueblo. They didn't recover very fast from it. One of the more fascinating things that happened during this time is the kiva in the North Plaza is actually probably abandoned, and then when it's rebuilt, probably in the late 1500s, early 1600s, they go out of their way not to just rebuild the kiva, but actually shift some of the architectural features in the kiva. Most notably, the ventilator shaft goes from being east. The ventilator shaft typically was pointing east before that time. All of a sudden, it starts to point south. This is a trait that's probably reminiscent of Kara-speaking peoples moving into the village during this time. So we had the Tiwa people that were living there. They brought on a lot of Mogollon people in the 1400s. And then sometime after 1540, a large group of Karas people seemed to come in and at least partially reoccupy the village, probably with existing Tiwa and Mogollon people still living there, because none of the other kivas are remodeled, just that one. And some of the other kivas are still in use during this time period. So you probably have some people that are speaking a Tiwa language as well as some people that are speaking a Karas as well. Karas at Kuaua Pueblo most likely come from Punami province, which is the area that includes modern-day Santa Ana and Zia Pueblos. This is the southernmost stretch of the Jemez River. These are Karas-speaking peoples, probably who migrated east from the Chacoan region following the end of things in that area. They're by the late 16th century, by the late 1500s, they're living in robust villages in this area, and certainly are expanding towards the middle Rio Grande still, and expanding south towards the Albuquerque area. Keep going because I am definitely going to run out of time. Side note on Coronado. I would say that, well, I am not a Coronado research expert, even though I managed a site called Coronado Historic Site. I actually left the work to other folks to actually prove Coronado was there. But really, within the last 20 years, research into the Coronado expedition is taking a dramatic and exciting turn. I'm not leading the charge on that, but some of my colleagues, Denny Seymour, Matt Schmader, Clay Mathers, they've all kind of, once people kind of identified what the cultural, what the artifacts were you were looking for to identify a Coronado site versus a later Spanish site. Once you kind of refined like what you're looking for, it's going to have crossbow. Differences are going to include. It's going to have a lot more crossbow heads. It's going to have these T-shaped hand-forged nails. It's you're going to find them using a metal detector survey. Don't try to pressure yourself into looking for other things, which the metal detector survey, interestingly enough, many of the tribes were the different Native American nations today were okay with metal detector surveys as opposed to more invasive archaeological excavation techniques in this area. What happened is all of a sudden the roof was blown off and Coronado sites everywhere. And interestingly enough, while Coronado Historic Site was named Coronado Historic Site and officially opened to the public in 1940, it wasn't until 2017 that we actually had definitive proof that Coronado had been at the village, and specifically that he attacked the village, and we can actually see that in the material culture and the locations of it in the area. But really, the research into this area is starting to change. People are starting to realize that everywhere they look, Coronado was there, and that's not surprising. His army was huge, and they needed a lot of forage, and they were also looking for things, and they hit a lot of different spaces. So here you can see a small graphic that depicts kind of the trajectory of Coronado in the American Southwest. I would be reminiscent. I would be not doing my job if I didn't promote Coronado a little during this lecture, even though he has nothing to do with the cultural identity of Kuaua Pueblo. Okay, unfortunately, things go, you think, well, God, the village survived Coronado's attack. Maybe there's an upward trajectory here, a feel-good notion and stuff like that. Well, the village recovers some. And it certainly recovered some by 1598 when the Spanish come to colonize New Mexico. Kuaua is, many pueblos become the centers for Franciscan missionary efforts. Kuaua was not that lucky. Kuaua got the bad end of the stick, which was it was actually subject to probably encomienda. Now you might say to yourself, encomiendas were illegal by the time the Spanish colonized Mexico. They absolutely were. Also, if you look at the Spanish documents, the word encomienda is used over and over and over again because they even bragged about it to each other that they were encomenderos. Certainly up, if you go to our historic site at Los Luceros, that guy was definitely bragging. Not necessarily Lucero, it's the Serrano family by that time, but I digress. Certainly Kuaua was integrated into the Durrani Chavez land grant and later appears to have been an encomienda under the Montoya family. There's some debate on exactly where their hacienda was, and I'm not saying that their hacienda was at Kuaua specifically. In fact, there is a small structure, relatively small, 5-room structure, just located just south of Kuaua Pueblo, known as LA 4955. That's a classification system we use in New Mexico, which has no relevance on what we're talking about today. Based on archaeological evidence at this structure, which was excavated in the 1970s, there appears to have been a lot of cotton and wool textile production at this little house. A lot. The harsh reality of LA 4955 is that the rooms were occupied for maybe at most 50 to 75 years. And that the building was burned in 1680. Just clearly straight up, we've got good evidence. Or relatively good evidence that it was burned at or around 1680. In that little 5-room structure, we found over 65, or the Museum in New Mexico, which I represent, or in Department of Cultural Affairs, found over 65 spindle whorls. That is not mama producing thread. That is cottage industry, or some sort of industry going on. And the presence of these items, along with the admitted notion that the Spanish referred to the area as Weaver's Bend, and the relatively small scale of the structure, animal bones, sheep and goat bones, this is maybe an industrial center for textile production, using the labor from Kuaua Pueblo. It's nice to call it a hacienda, but it really doesn't have all the features you'd expect in a hacienda. You could say, well, they're probably doing some agriculture too, and yes, they probably were, but they probably didn't need that scale of spindle whorls to be doing that kind of stuff. And then, mind you, it's not just spindle whorls. You have things like this. Thimble. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong on that. Sorry, thimble's not the right word for that artifact there. It's the one you use to make sure you're. And there was needles too, and all sorts of stuff. You wouldn't believe the amount of textile and kind of stuff like that going around that household. It's probably a workshop, guys. Nobody's been brave enough to say that in print yet. That sounds really horrible. We've speculated about it, kind of hinted at it, but nobody wants to say that. But I digress. That said, that building burns, but nobody in the Bernalillo area dies in the Pueblo Revolt. In fact, Kuaua may not have participated in the revolt at all. And in fact, that might seem strange to people. Why wouldn't they do it? Well, they may have been fully integrated into that Spanish culture by the time the revolt happened in 1680. In fact, it's largely the Pueblo villages that have missions that end up participating in the revolt, not these ones that are, in essence, integrated into Spanish village life during this period. In fact, the Spanish documents were very clear. Everybody in Bernalillo lived. They were tipped off, or not tipped off because, in essence, there was a miracle that happened, according to the stories of Bernalillo and Kuaua Pueblo. The miracle of San Lorenzo. In fact, this miracle still exists today. You can actually go witness it every August 10th, so the day of the Pueblo Revolt. Well, many Native American communities will celebrate the idea of the day of their uprising and stuff like that. The village of Bernalillo actually celebrates St. Lawrence, which is August 10th is St. Lawrence's Day, because according to the mythology of the Spanish village of Bernalillo, which resides in essence where Kuaua Pueblo does today, St. Lawrence appeared the night before the revolt and said, "Hey guys, you got to get out of town. If you're here tomorrow, they're going to kill you." They all packed up their stuff and left, and nobody from the village of Bernalillo died in the revolt. Likely that was an informant from Kuaua Pueblo telling them that perhaps they needed to get out of town. In fact, most of the people at Kuaua Pueblo probably left with them. And in fact, you have a large Tiwa population living outside El Paso, which is where the people of Bernalillo fled to today. It's called Isleta del Sur. It's a Tiwish Pueblo down by El Paso that's still, and it's perhaps more Hispanicized than many of the other villages that we would think of, because it carries on more. It has perhaps a more mix of Spanish and native cultural traditions than perhaps we would think of with some of our pueblos up north here today. But they go by it. In fact, though, today at Bernalillo, you can still go every August 10th and you will see them dancing. They actually do when de Vargas, General de Vargas or Governor de Vargas resettled Bernalillo, the village of Bernalillo in 1693, the people who resettled there gave a promise to St. Lawrence that they would dance in his honor every year. And so they dance about killing the pagan natives, because of course they do. And I be clear, I'm part of this community. So I actually live in Bernalillo today and participate in this this community ritual. But I do notice the hypocrisy of talking about killing Native Americans, dancing to the conversion and killing of the pagan peoples and the dance of machachinas. Now, many Pueblo peoples also perform machachinas today, so this is not unique to the Bernalillo area, but specifically doing it on St. Lawrence's Day, which is in essence a Pueblo feast day for the Spanish village of Bernalillo, is symbolic. In fact, you have to imagine that if Kuaua Pueblo had continued and had they built a mission there, it would have been St. Lawrence Pueblo or San Lorenzo, Pueblo de San Lorenzo. Okay, keep going on. 6 minutes left. So I want to move to the name. So why do we call it Kuaua Pueblo? Well, the first informant to call it Kuaua Pueblo, there's some Spanish documents in the late 16th century which call it Guagua. There's a debate over what Guagua means. Later Spanish documents, interestingly enough, in the early 17th century, when it's completely under Spanish encomienda, they never call it anything. In fact, if you think it's, there are several documents that may mention it as Tigwe, or they may call it a city, a broad city or something like that, but they don't actually give any accurate. In fact, it's almost mythological in those cases. It's obvious it's something that the Spanish document person writing the account, which is a Franciscan mission, had never actually visited the village. But both modern day Tiwa and Kara speakers use the term Guagua or Kuaua today to signify the village. So multiple Native American groups actually use the same title today. Amongst the Tiwas, it's Kuaua translates to roughly evergreen or evergreen place. Amongst the Karas, it's known as South Place or South. And we can get into both of those reasons, I think, in the South Place. If we were to look at where Kuaua Pueblo is today on a map, you'll notice that there is a blue Karas bunch around the middle of Rio Grande. There's a green Tiwa bunch on that map you see before you. That little empty space between those two blobs on that map is the area where Kuaua Pueblo stays. So it's really right on that cusp of both being Karas and Tiwa. It's unlikely that they called it Evergreen Place traditionally for a lot of reasons, even though that's the name in Tiwish today is evergreen. Most of the trees along the middle Rio Grande are cottonwoods. They're deciduous trees. There's very little evergreen in the area. It seems like a very strange name for it. However, amongst the Keres, South Place makes a lot of sense. If you look at that blob of the Eastern Keres peoples, which includes your Santa Ana, San Felipe, Kuaua Pueblo, Zia, Cochiti, and so on, Kuaua would absolutely represent the southernmost village that those people lived in historically. But multiple names and ambiguity of meaning is actually really common amongst Pueblo place names. In fact, if you go to any village today, a lot of times, depending upon who you ask, even if they use the same word, it'll have different meaning depending upon who you ask. A good example, I'm going to use Jemez again as an example because that's where I did most of my research. Wallatoa, right? What does that mean? Well, it could mean village in the valley, depending upon how, Walla is close to that word in Toa, or it could mean bear village. It could mean a couple different things, right? Depending upon who you ask and stuff like that. Kuaua is probably the same way. It may have been called Kuaua by everybody, but had a different meaning depending upon which ethnic group or which cultural tradition you came from. Also highlighting the fact that it's a multi-ethnic village. So I'm going to sum up because I'm just at about 5 o'clock, and I do want to leave some time for questions, though I don't think I did a good job of that. So to summarize, if I hope you take anything away from this lecture, is that first and foremost, Native American peoples in the American Southwest were a diverse group. And even if we lump all the people who lived in villages together as Pueblo peoples, there was a lot of different Pueblo peoples. At Kuaua, there was at least 3 major ethnic groups that lived there. We think the Tiwish peoples that were ancestral to the Middle Rio Grande, the Mogollon peoples who migrated in the 1400s, and the Keres people who came to call the place home after the sacking of the village by Coronado in 1540. In fact, some of those Keres people may have lived there beforehand, but they actually created their own kiva after that time period. Coronado was a destructive force. In the 17th century, the Spanish did establish a hacienda or some sort of structure just south of Kuaua Pueblo, and the Pueblo's history kind of goes dark as a result of whatever they're doing at that structure. At least that's my interpretation. But then whatever did happen led to some enculturation amongst the Spanish, and as a result, Bernalillo was likely saved from the full wrath of the Pueblo peoples during the revolt in 1680. Lastly, Kuaua could mean a lot of different things depending upon who you ask, but the most 2 common are Evergreen Place or South Place, and South Place from an academic standpoint makes a lot more sense given the village's location within the Keres world during the 16th and 17th centuries. With that, I don't know how much time they're going to give you for questions, but anything I have that I have mentioned today that you're like, well, I don't think that's right. I want to know where he got that stuff from. You can email me and I will be happy to share your sources. Doesn't mean it's the only interpretation out there. Everybody's entitled to make their own interpretation, but I hope at least this was somewhat informative and entertaining today. So thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. It was all of those things and fascinating. Can you stay on for a few extra minutes? And
yes, absolutely.
And for folks who have to leave, Matthew kindly put up his email. Taylor also already put your email in the chat.
Fair enough. Go for it.
And you will get a follow-up email from Crow Canyon as always, and Taylor will send Matthew's email in that as well. So because there's some, we won't be able to get to all the questions, but so you can indeed, with his permission, pester him. But let me grab a couple of these and bring him up. There's I of course was also fascinated about the San Lorenzo appearance and feast day, and one of our viewers pointed out that a lot of the other pueblos and organizers of the Pueblo Revolt have feast days on August 10th. What's that about?
So Picary's has it the same day. Picary's does it St. Lawrence's Day. Yeah, you can go to. I never get to go to Picary's feast day. In fact, the Festival of San Lawrence, if you've been to it before, chances are you've sat in my yard because my neighbor has hosted the saint more times than I can count or you've seen my children sitting in a house where the Saints hosted this year is actually my my kid's nanny's house growing up. Any rate, there's a lot of different reasons to celebrate August 10th as a very important day. St. Lawrence is one of the saints that was pushed very heavily by the Franciscan missionaries amongst the Pueblo peoples, but its association specifically with Bernalillo has to do with the Pueblo Revolt and literally a promise they made to St. Lawrence and to General de Vargas upon the resettlement of the village in 1693. So I don't know if that answers the question per se, but yes, lots of different places do it for very, very different reasons. Pickeries is not doing it to celebrate the fact that the people of Bernalillo were spared from the revolt. It has very much to do with the missionaries in the mission process at Pickeries Pueblo.
Right. Cool. Well, I got to ask sort of the elephant in the room question is, are we still going to call it Coronado Historic Site?
Okay, that's a loaded question, right? Because like if you don't call it Coronado, so to be clear, several legislatures have actually brought this up in wanting to support. I think everybody agrees Coronado as a name is highly problematic, and that's absolutely fair, especially as we try to decolonize history. That is completely legit. Coronado is not a good name to be using for many indigenous groups in the American Southwest, and I totally respect that. The problem with challenge with calling it something else is what do you call it? And in essence, names have power. Names have meaning. Doing it, saying Kuaua Pueblo is a possibility. That certainly is a argument can be made for Kuaua Pueblo, depending upon how you pronounce Kuaua Pueblo and how you interpret it in your museum, could in essence disenfranchise one group over another, depending upon using that word. That was likely probably not the only word for the village. My recommendation, and I'm saying this on a public format, has always been to try to call it Tigwe Historic Site. While Tigwe is a large term used for the Middle Rio Grande and the Tigwe villages that occurred in the general Albuquerque area. There's Tigwe Park and stuff like that. The reason I would use the word Tigwe is whether it was the name of the village or not, it was the name of both the war Coronado engaged in the area, the Winter War of 1540 to 1541 is known as the Tigwe War. It was also the name of the general area under the term the Spanish used for the Tiwish peoples. While that's still somewhat problematic, it highlights both the Spanish elements of the history as well as the indigenous elements. That said, getting people to agree on a name is, everybody can agree to want to change the name. That is totally cool. Agreeing on what to call it is not something that has been a very easy thing. And I still see, I'll tell you guys that in the next 20 years, there will be a change. I mean, I firmly believe that. Whether it's during my tenure, I don't know. And certainly I have no opinion officially, other than to say that my advisement has always been that it would be better named Tigwe Pueblo to both honor the Spanish history of the village as well as the indigenous aspects of the village. And to be clear, the indigenous aspects of the village, everybody knew from an early time period, even when they called it Coronado State Monument, which was its original name, became historic site when we changed our branding. Everybody knew what was important about the site early on. The archaeologists were interested in preserving and interpreting the murals. So it was never that Native American culture was pushed to the side at this site. It was always prevalent. And in fact, if you go to the site today, the tour you will take is largely one of the Native American history of the village. It's not to say that you're going to get a huge lecture on Coronado and how his attack occurred.
Right. Thank you.
Slow process.
Yeah,
next question.
There's no easy answer to that, but from our perspective here, whatever it's named, it's a teachable moment to talk about colonization, the impact on cultures, how it's not an easy question of naming. These are as long as we're having the discourse and not just uncritically accepting the name, and that's what's most important is pretty awesome. I'm going to ask this question because I had the same one. One of our viewers said, "Is it likely the hacienda's cottage industry was slavery, right? As the encomienda system?"
No. It was slavery. I want to be clear. Yes, I just kind of dodge around it. And I want to be clear. Nobody says that in print anywhere. So if you're asking me for an exact reference, We have a wonderful publication that talks about the excavation. You can read about the different spindle whorls that were found there and all the things that are problematic. That if you start thinking about it, man, that doesn't sound like a hacienda. These haciendas were big with enclosed courtyards, very self-sufficient. And instead, you're talking about a 5-room structure where the majority of the artifacts were actually spindle whorls. That seems really strange to me. Yes, it should seem really strange to you. That's not normal. That, I mean, as somebody who's focused on Spanish colonial and specifically in the downtown Santa Fe area and throughout New Mexico, that's weird. That doesn't match with your idea of what a Spanish hacienda or even a Spanish house would look like. And it's isolated by itself just south of the village. It looks really strange. I imagine that perhaps not me, but the future generations will start to reinterpret that space based upon the evidence they have. And probably, I would imagine that perhaps more of that stuff occurred in New Mexico than we know about, and that perhaps research into the colonial era, what's really big right now is Coronado, right? Maybe in another generation, you're going to see that push towards looking at some of these colonial structures a little bit more in depth and challenging the notion that we just use the word that if you have a Spanish structure isolated on the frontier, that it's a hacienda. When realistically, it just because it has a fireplace doesn't make it a house. So keep that in mind. You know, if laborers are working 24/7, you got to keep them warm if you want to keep them alive. So that doesn't, to me, like some of the features
doesn't make it cozy.
Don't necessarily make it a house.
Yeah, no, good point. And that would be a really important area of research for someone to pick up, all you graduate students out there. Someone asked, when do people stop living at Kuaua?
So about 1680.
Okay.
So I want to be clear about this. So there's definitely a population decline after 1540, and then there's a resettlement. We got that down easy.
Yeah.
There's some later pottery at Kuaua to suggest Native American peoples were still visiting the site in the 1700s. Whether they were visiting the site out of some sort of connection to the past or where they were actually living at the site remains more open to debate. To my knowledge, no domestic features with carbon 14 dates and stuff like this. We definitely have some pottery that's a little bit later, looking like people came back there and visited it, but that doesn't mean they were staying there for long periods of time, or maybe they stayed there off and on. Maybe they were using part of the ruins to kind of hang out in sometimes. There could have been a lot of reasons why that stuff's there. Certainly, there's no major population after 1680.
After 1680. So no one was killed in the revolt, but that house was burned, huh?
Yes, isn't that fascinating in and of itself?
So what's that about?
As an act of defiance. So you have the historical record, which tells you, according to the Spanish, nobody in Bernalillo died as a result of the revolt. They all got out. St. Lawrence magically appeared. It had to be an informal. I'm just going to be clear that like, even if you're deeply religious, and you can be deeply religious, the more likely plausible explanation is that somebody warned them. But that said, if nobody died, they still went out of their way to burn that structure. And that in and of itself is a cool act of resistance, possibly pointing to the fact that it wasn't a home again. And perhaps it had some bad memories associated with it. So an act of defiance. In fact, one of the things I'd like to point out about the Pueblo Revolt nowadays, and I think this is a very, very important thing. The revolt was not bloodless, and the reconquest was not bloodless by any stretch of the imagination. But I would point out to our indigenous communities, and I think this is a point of great pride that more people should honor, is that the Pueblo communities, while they did kill some people, they murdered some priests, they did definitely attack Santa Fe, they showed remarkable restraint in their efforts to drive the Spanish south. In fact, the most notable one I will point out to you is that after the Spanish decide to leave Santa Fe, the Pueblo peoples follow the Spanish retreat south. They do not attack it. Or I know of no account where they actually attacked the retreating Spanish. So the goal was to get them out, not to cause more bloodshed. And I think that's an important part of this history that we oftentimes miss in the interpretation of it, that while there was war and conflict and stuff like that, that a lot of it, and to be clear, that even when we study the earlier revolts, like the Jemez Revolt of 1623, most of the people who died in that revolt were other Jemez people, probably at the hands of Jemez people. Native Americans were the victims of were the majority of victims of these revolts, and it's hard and sad in a lot of ways. But specifically, there was a level of restraint in a lot of, especially in the later revolts of 1680. The Jemez Revolt of 1623 is really bad because if you go by the Spanish estimates, 30,000 Jemez lost their lives in that, probably to other Jemez people for the most part. And that has to do with, unfortunately, then you say to yourself, well, why were they killing each other? Unfortunately, Spanish policy was to use indigenous military resources to quell other indigenous military uprisings. So you did not send Spanish citizens to fight your wars. You spent other indigenous troops largely. So if the Tewa were having a hard time with the Toa peoples, they sent the Tewa to deal with the Jemez or whatever. Those kind of actions did actually occur quite a bit. But in the actual uprising in which the Native American peoples united, they showed remarkable constraint in not attacking the Spanish. So I think
that's an excellent point. Excellent, thank you. And kind of one of our questions is that can you compare the religious practices and beliefs of Kuaua with other Pueblo communities? Which
no, I'm not. I'm sorry. I'm not going to. So I could probably say some things from a Western perspective that I see in the murals. I don't think I have any real reason to speak about Native American religion or belief systems. I think if Native American people feel comfortable talking about that, that's cool. If they don't feel comfortable talking about that, that's also cool. For me, the interpretation of Kuaua Pueblo, we only focus on things that are specifically within public knowledge and just fun things you can point out from an artistic perspective, such as like the fact that water is depicted a lot, but what animals are depicted and how do those show up in the murals? One of the kind of fun things that I point out, which has, to my knowledge, no religious symbolism, but is a continuity thing that you can point out just from looking at these images from an outsider's perspective. You can see things like, for example, Kuaua definitely had a moiety system. And you go, how are you so sure about that? Well, all the images that are drawn in the murals from time immemorial in that one kiva are all depicted in orange paint, suggesting they were all from southern or pumpkin moiety, depending upon
interesting.
So it was definitely from one of the Pueblo was used by one of the two moieties. In fact, that there are no depictions of the other one is interesting of itself. We can also point out, Kasharis are open public knowledge. We can point out the fact that there's a Kashari that appears off and on in the murals over and over again. But as far as some of the religious figures, I don't want to specifically talk to those. Oh, another thing I could say that's kind of fun about the murals there, which will never make you see them in light again. In fact, I don't have a picture of it. I don't even want to look to see if Sunfather has the image on him. So for the most part, the murals at Kuaua, everything follows gravity. There is a few items in those murals that do not follow gravity. And one of the most important ones that I find just so fascinating, because it's through time. You got to remember because it couldn't have been one artist. Multiple people had to die and contribute to those art pieces, but everybody drew it the same way. So that the sash that Native Americans often wear, depending on whether it's a spiritual being or whatnot, it has at the back of it, I'm forgetting the right word right now, it has these clouds with rain coming down off of them, these little cotton balls and stuff like that. If you look at the murals of Kuaua Pueblo, every one of those sashes should hang down to the ground because everything else follows gravity. Those sashes never follow gravity. They're always put where the clouds are coming out at the sides and the rain's coming straight out to them. I find that very interesting because in many reasons, they make those images look very, very lifelike. That is an intentional way of depicting those rain sashes on those individuals. And it's over and over. Everybody did it. I find that fascinating. What does that mean? I have no idea. But it's very curious that whatever says you draw that like that continued throughout time. And so I don't want to get into the belief system, though, too. You can, as I said, unfortunately or fortunately for you, depending upon your perspective, there's a lot of stuff published. I'm not saying, first of all, I don't know if it's right or wrong. I was never raised in a Pueblo community. I wouldn't know. And even if somebody shared that information with me, it wouldn't be my place to share that information with anybody else because it's not my information. So I'm sorry about that. I know there's a lot of questions about the religious beings depicted at Kuaua Pueblo. I am just not the kind of person that likes to interpret that kind of stuff.
No, that's a really excellent answer. We had one just pop up here in our overtime period, a confirmation around the spindles. It's an interesting question. Back in the workshop, were those spindles Spanish or native manufacture? Huh?
So they're largely made of Native American pottery. They're so spindle whorls are discs with a hole drilled in them, and they're usually made out of native pottery. They're probably made out of broken pots. They're just getting pieces reused.
But they're not metal. They're not imported.
No. Yeah, I mean, you have some. You have the needles are metal. The thimble, which I'm hoping I'm using the right word there. I am not somebody who's super into the fiber arts, so bear with me, guys. The thimble is made of metal. There was a nice and it's still on display now. There's a beautiful what looks like a very nice perhaps wedding ring. I'm speculating here. We don't know if it's a wedding ring. There's a nice beautiful ring that somebody with a lot of wealth probably brought up with them. There's a couple things, but once again, those things are not common in out there Spanish haciendas on the frontier. Right. Those are people, if they're really living a rugged life in 5 rooms, they don't have that wealth. If they have that wealth that they're able to import this stuff, there was Maiolica there and stuff like that. There's certainly some Spanish elites there. I want to be very clear about that. But the wealth depicted in that structure in some ways, it kind of goes both ways, right? It's not, it really doesn't look like somebody on hard scrabble on the frontier. It looks more like somebody doing something that maybe is not so flattering. And unfortunately, probably what you're getting is the missionaries were pretty good about reporting at least a little bit what they were doing. It's those dark areas surrounding those villages that didn't have a mission system where things seem to be going a lot worse. And that's a terrible thing. In fact, I always tried to mention that, most of the pueblos that had Spanish missions exist today. Most of the villages that were not given a mission do not exist today. Right. So like at Jemez, there were 3 sites that had missions, one of which still exists today. It's Walatoa. The other one, Gisela Pueblo had a mission too. But the other villages in that area probably declined way faster as a result of not having a missionary in the area. And I'm not saying the Spanish were preying on all of those villages, but it probably got very dark very quick. And you can interpret that any way you want because those villages disappear very quickly. Right. And the missionaries were probably selective for a lot of different reasons why they chose to convert at the places they did. And it's not just to muster in souls and stuff like that. It probably had to do with protection to some extent. So even though the missionaries, we tend to think the Franciscans nowadays, they kind of get a bad rap in a lot of ways. Those guys were living out in the frontier and they were trying to protect and save people to the best of their ability. In fact, when I did the study at Gisela and I looked at the missionaries there, it's like doing a tour of duty in Vietnam. 1 in 4 of those guys never came back. It was a hard career choice. If you were going to be a missionary in New Mexico, that was a hard path to go. So,
wow. So fantastic. The San Lorenzo appearance reminds me, I spent Dia de los Muertos last year in San Miguel de Allende and watched a dance that reenacted the Chichimecas who were resisting colonization, having a battle with the Spanish, and a huge cross appeared in the sky above the Chichimecas army, indicating to them that they needed to stop and convert. So there's probably a lot of other corollaries to
I'm sure there
San Lorenzo or crosses appearing in the sky to influence battles in some way. So interesting stuff. It's 20 after. I'm so sorry to the folks we didn't get to all the questions. Please do go ahead and email. There's some specific ones in there that I'm sure Mr. Barbour will be happy to take and keep the conversation going. So much fun to meet you. Come up to Crow Canyon.
Will do. Take it easy, guys. Have a good day.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.